Clapper board, you're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled Aliens Terrified When Humans Tell Them of Earth's Grim Reaper sci-fi space opera. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. It began with a wind that had no air and a bell that had no clapper. Across the inner rim of the loyal arc, alarms told through vacuum in the only way alarms can. A crawl of red along the edges of displays, a prickle across skin, the sound of breath becoming too loud in a helmet. The star city of Mazarath turned slowly above the blue-white flame of a young sun. Its ring habitats shimmered with the green of parks, the silver of reservoirs, the gold of drifting harvest ships returning from their seasonal trawls. The collective had declared an era of peace 3 generations earlier, and peace had grown fat and drowsy. And then the black geometry arrived. It fell like a shadow that had finally caught up. The first thing sensors registered was the absence of starlight, triangular voids blossoming like night bloom flowers, erasing constellations and the hawk feather thin light of the sun. Gravity told a different story. Mass appeared where mass had not been, stuff with no signature. Hulls that drank scans the way parched ground drinks rain. Artificial, the analysts whispered. No, said the admirals, predatory. No, said the archivists, shaking with old stories, patient. The first shot did not look like a shot, it looked like night. It unfurled from one of those black triangles, a ribbon of absence that crossed 30,000 kilometers in a single breath and kissed a defense spire that had guarded Mazarath for 200 years. The spire simply ceased to be. Water from its coolant loops exploded into steam. The sky turned to mirror. The mirror fell and cut the city in a million places. The collective scrambled its fleets. Ratchari insectoid cruisers molt-dumped their heat and sprinted like mad silver fish. Vessels of the Selene diaspora pivoted on magnetic fields like slow ballet dancers, exquisite and deadly. The Vec Council's ships were knives. The Perjury ran chorus algorithms that modulated their hulls into song. And the humans, late arrivals, late to everything, spun up drives on vessels that looked almost embarrassed to be present, battered plates welded over older plates, old names stenciled on hulls like scars. Cassiopeia's Mercy, Hecate Runner, New Providence. The first battle was short and indecisive in the way that a fist to the solar plexus is indecisive. It did not destroy you. It only educated every molecule in your body about how fragile breath is. Mazarath lived, but its night did not return to the proper place between stars. The black geometry withdrew, not beaten, just finished. In the aftermath, the council convened in a chamber of pearl and shadow. Delegates hung in the air on soft tether thrones, their body shapes spelling out the vast grammar of the galaxy. A Ratchari of the 4th caste groomed its antennae with trembling forelimbs. A Selene wore a face of patient moonlight. The human delegation, 3 officers in charcoal uniforms, shoulders square, hair clipped close, waited with their hands on their knees like they were sitting on a bus going home from work. Designation. The chair asked, an amphibian with a throat sac that shone faintly when it spoke. The analysts projected sigils, unreadable returns, silence divination. The Ratchari clicked. Nothing returns from its surfaces. It swallows both inquiry and reply. Origin, unknown. Motive, acquisition of night, murmured the Perjury in a voice like the edge of a bell. Fable, the Selene objected. Please. It cuts, said Admiral Shava of the People's Navy, her human voice flat with fatigue. That is motive enough. What do you call it, then? The chair asked. Shava glanced at the other humans. Her second, a quiet man named Mason Care, had a face that looked like it was always about to smile and never did. The third, a civilian anthropologist with a half-healed scar on her forehead, kept her eyes closed. Shava ran her tongue against the back of her teeth, a small private countdown. We call it the harrow, she said. Harrow, the Vec demanded, his crest rising. Explain the word. It's a tool that drags teeth through the soil after the plow has turned it, the anthropologist said, opening her eyes at last. It breaks clods, it makes earth fine, ready for seed. A silence spread, layered and soft but dangerous like snow building on a roof. And if we are soil, asked the perjury. Then someone has already plowed you, Mason Care said. The chair's sack paled to ash. You humans with your knives of language, you would make a fable out of an existential threat. Yes, Shava said calmly, we would, it's how we aim. There were murmurs, a flicker of anger in a dozen languages. Then, unexpectedly, the Seleni delegate tilted their head the way a thoughtful owl does when considering a mouse that quotes poetry. Aim requires a target, they said. Do you have one? Not yet. Shava's hands flexed on her knees. But we have a story. The room bristled. Not now, someone groaned. Not planet tail time. Now, said the anthropologist softly. Because you are about to hear the one thing everyone in this chamber needs to know about us. And it's not about our ships or our tactics. It's about our house on the shore where the wind comes hard in winter. It's about the person who waits at the edge of the light with a scythe. Who? The chair demanded, exasperated. Death, Mason said. He did not smile. The word landed like a coin dropped down a deep well. Some species had words for termination, for cessation of biological function, for the thinning out of consciousness until it was as weak as an old tea. But a person, a certainty that walks. Yes, the anthropologist said, seeing the disbelief. We made it a person, we gave it a face, we call it the Reaper. Your death has a name, the Ratchari whispered. It has many, Mason said, but Grim Reaper works, it's easy to say with cold lips. The Seleni made a dismissive gesture. Primitive superstition, you would feed us this as strategy. Shava leaned forward. Her eyes were not angry, merely intent. You misunderstand. You think we are trying to teach you mythology. We are telling you how we became a species that does not curl around the ember of its own fear. We learned to look at the end and speak to it as if it were a neighbor who might borrow sugar. We named it. We argued with it. We shaped our lives around its inevitability. We are not less afraid than you are. We are simply trained. Trained, the chair repeated, tasting the word. Mason glanced at the door, at the thin line of light beneath it, at his own reflected face in the polished floor. Trained to do what soldiers do when the night comes, which is to go out to meet it. There was no applause. There was only the quiet recognition of a boundary drawn and the sudden feeling among many in that chamber that they were standing on the wrong side of it. In the days that followed, fear spread through the ark as rapidly as mold in a wet room. The Harrow's withdrawal had not been strategic. The analysts decided it had been exploratory. It had tapped. It had listened to the ring of the thing it struck. It would return. The collective moved industry like a body moves blood to a wounded limb. The Ratchari spun lattice mines, the Seleni pressed their gravity fabricators, the Vec hammered new edges into old hulls. The perjury wrote new songs to shape fields. The field singers bled from mouths and eyes in rehearsal. Human factories, the kind with roofs of patched tin that leak in the spring, warmed up old furnaces. Earth had come into the stars late and poor, but Earth had a different wealth. When the requests began, they did not start with admiralty. They began at kitchen tables with old photographs laid out under the hand of a mother or a father. They began in small rooms where the light was harsh on small scars. They began wherever the people who had carried flag-draped coffins or broken up the fights of boys too young for beer sat quietly and counted living faces. They began with people who knew the Reaper, because of a protocol written during another winter of another war, because of a phrase in the code that had not seen light for 50 years. Because of an odd human habit of building doors and then painting them closed, but never bricking them up. The protocol had a name, too. Humans name things. They name storms. They name the ache under a healed wound. They named this Project Psychopomp. The word meant guide of souls. To the collective, it sounded like sacrilege, if sacrilege is possible in a culture that had no temples but loved the sacred lines of mathematics. To humans, it was just the acceptance of the truth that some missions begin with an end already in them like a seed. Psychopomp was simple in the way a lever is simple and can move a mountain. It took volunteers who had written death letters, men and women who had held their own funerals in their hearts, and put them into ships designed not to survive but to accomplish. They would fly black and close. They would trace the shape of the harrow with their bodies. They would teach the fleet where to aim. The council balked. "It is murder," the Cellini said. "It is consent," Mason replied. "You will waste lives. We will spend them. You will teach your children that death is a tool." "We already did," said the anthropologist, her scar pale as chalk. "They are very good at it." The chair looked at Shava for a long time. "You would have us become you." "No," Shava said, and for the first time there was tenderness in her voice. "We would have you become ready." Ready did not look like victory. It looked like the slow accumulation of what would be needed when victory became possible. People with their affairs in order, ships with their seams caulked and their coils tuned, supply chains that ran like the veins in a child's wrist. Ready looked like goodbye that meant something. Ready looked like a midnight train station in rain. Ready tasted like coffee at dawn that makes your throat feel like singing and tears. They built Psychopomp quietly, not because they were ashamed, but because quiet was respectful, and because the harrow listened. Mason spent nights lying on the deck plates of Cassiopeia's Mercy, ear to the old metal that had outlived its first war, and maybe could be convinced to outlive another. He wrote music on a battered guitar with half its strings. He did not play for the crew because he did not want to turn himself into a thing that made noise just to comfort others. He knew that his job was to see clearly. That is the hardest work in a war. The harrow returned 6 weeks after Mazarath's sky shattered. It did not come alone. The black triangles came like a school of rays passing beneath a swimmer. They took up positions around the system like the points of a compass understood by an intelligence that did not think in circles but in wedges. The first Psychopomp cotter went out in 8 ships. They didn't paint skulls on their hulls. They didn't run lights. They went with quiet engines and breaths measured to the count of 4. They threaded void between edges that bent light and ate telemetry. They went as animals go when they know the hunter's scent, but also as hunters go when they know their prey's bones. Shava watched from the command ring, hands clasped so tightly the bones of her knuckles were white stones under skin. The council chamber no longer hovered beneath the dome. It had descended into the ship's bowels, where light and heat were rationed and the air smelled faintly of hot tin. The chair floated at her shoulder, eyes glossy. The Cellini delegate had not come. They had retreated to their own ships to pray to equations. "Telemetry," Shava said, and her voice had the tight, bright sound of a wire pulled almost to breaking. "Minimal," the analyst said. "Harrow surfaces remain absorptive. We are reading negative glare in the infrared. I have never seen that." The screen showed 8 human ships as 8 faint motes, almost imaginary. They moved with a deliberation that resembled slowness as patience resembles weakness. They threaded a path Mason had found in the long moments when he lay with his ear to metal, listening for a heartbeat that did not belong to their ship. He had heard a rhythm, not sound but pattern, a fold and unfold like a fist. They went in on that cadence. The first report came from the Mercy. "We feel it," Mason said. His voice was that of a man reading a letter by a window where rain drew silver lines and did not expect the letter to be kind. "It inhales. When it inhales, the edges drink. When it exhales, the seams glow." "Seams," Shava repeated. The word was stupid with hope. "Where plates meet plates," Mason said. "Like armor. It's not monolithic," breathed the perjury field singer. "It is made." Ships died as they learned. The fourth ship touched a seam with a probe and became a powdered thing, a dust that remembered once being hot. The fifth died without sound. The sixth ran out of attitude control because it had burned all its fuel describing a new word in space, a word that meant here. The seventh hung against the harrow's edge and listened, then went quiet not because it was destroyed, but because its captain turned off everything so she could hear one last second of the truth. She said one word, overlap. Then she was gone, overlap where the seams met, where the plates doubled, where armor ate itself, where greed made a weakness. Mason's ship reached the inside of that word. He saw what no one else had seen. The harrow was not a ship at all. It was a tool used by a desire that did not live inside it. The tool had rooms. The rooms glowed as if a fire had been lit in bone. At the center there was not a bridge but a kiln. Exothermic heart. He whispered. What does that mean, Mason? Shava asked. She never called him by his rank. It means, he said, and for the first time he smiled, that it can be choked. They did not have the hands yet to strangle it, but they had chords. They had minds. They had songs in the perjury throat that could put a field on the world. They had Ratchari teeth and Selene loveliness that could raise walls of gravity like symmetric castles that trapped light as if light were a seabird. Panicked and too bright. They had human patience. The thing the Reaper taught is that you should put your coat on before you go out into the snow because the snow does not care that you are beautiful or a poet. Psychopomp wrote the first doctrine, choke points at overlap seams. Human sappers knitted constellations of microcharges and lured the harrow's breath to pull those charges into its mouth. Ratchari ships learned to sing in trance-like clicks that disoriented the black edges the same way a baby is soothed by a low hum near a heart. Selene engines turned the room where the harrow's heart burned into a slower room until heat did not know how to leave it, until heat became sullen. The harrow began to change. It adapted with frightening grace, like an athlete who learns a new dance and is improved by the injury after their first rehearsal. It moved seams. It widened overlaps. It broke rules it had written with its own existence. Human ships wrote new rules in blood. You cannot outpace a thing that writes its own physics unless you are willing to expend the one resource even physics must bow to, the will of conscious beings to perish with meaning. The second psychopomp cotter went out and did not return, but they left a map. The third went out and returned with a probe that stank of cold and another word. Limiter. The harrow had chains in it. The chains did not bind with steel, they bound with restraint. The tool could have been worse, but someone somewhere sometime had decided not to make it so. Mercy or fear of their own creation. Someone built this with their hand on the brake, Mason said, blinking hard because his eyes wanted something to wash them that tears could not provide. We can use the brake. How? The chair asked. The chair slept between meetings and woke gasping. The harrow had followed them into their dreams, pushing its edges against the fabric of consciousness. We tell it a story, the anthropologist said. The Selene scoffed, again, but softer. The scoff had sorrow in it now. Everything is not the mirror of earth. No, she agreed. But makers make in their own image. If the builders of the harrow feared their own tool, they taught it obedience. We can become the voice it learned. They searched for the voice not with radios but with the perjury's bell-edged throats and with humans' throats that had sung lullabies to children in homes where the walls shook when trains passed. They built a choir in a starship's cargo bay. The choir practiced inhaling when the harrow inhaled, exhaling when it exhaled, becoming the ear and the mouth of an absent master. The first time they sang to it, nothing happened. The second time, it hesitated. The third time, one of its seams moved in obedience to a human note. And in the gap behind that seam, they placed a mind the size and weight of a human heart. The harrow screamed. Space has no sound, but ships do, and the scream was the way displays filled with error. The way gravity hiccuped in chambers that had never known wind felt it. Psychopomp had teeth now. The collective went from bracing to biting. The war became a season. It had months that tasted like copper and months that tasted like ash. The harrow multiplied. It learned to build more of itself in the lee of white dwarfs where no one would look. Psychopomp multiplied too. Human memorials grew, and the memorials did not look like marble. They looked like kitchens that remembered how to continue without the person who made the best eggs. The Ratchari discovered that their silk could be tuned to feel the harrow's breath in planar ripples. The Seleni wrote a new gravity grammar that allowed a singularity to go to sleep without devouring the pillow it lay upon. The Vec became pragmatists, which was something like becoming saints for their people. Mazarath lived, barely. They armored its ring like a town puts shutters on windows when the hurricane comes. The Star City's parks became farms, its reservoirs became ice, its gold turned to bullets and probes. Under those pressed conditions, life did the thing it always does when it is most threatened. It grew sweeter. A kiss in a corridor meant more. A meal with soup meant having soup and someone to eat it with. Laughter sounded like an act of astrophysics, like bending a light that could not be bent. Admiral Shava didn't sleep much. She refused to tell people how much she didn't sleep because maps printed on faces are not useful in war. She smoked carefully rationed cigarettes not because nicotine made her wise, but because it made a ritual out of stealing time back from a thing that wanted it. She listened to Mason's occasional guitar and did not ask for more because begging beauty from a soldier is rude. Mason went out again. He kissed the anthropologist on the forehead when he passed her in a narrow hall. The scar on her head shone like a moon in a different phase. "You sure?" she asked. "No," he said. "Good," she said. "People who are sure should not talk to death." The Third Battle of Mazarath began not with an attack but with a darkness that rolled in like tide. The harrow did not bother with geometry this time. It came like mist over a river where people fish with lanterns. It came without edges. It came in the language of flood. The fleet fell back because there is no shame in not knowing how to fight water in the sky. In the flood, light behaved like a drunk at a wedding where too much love had been promised and too much love had been spent. It staggered. It fell, laughing. It got up again out of obstinacy. Human ships flashed Morse against their own hulls, an old code banging on an old door. The harrow learned to read it and sneered, the way a storm sneers at a lighthouse. Then the choir sang. They sang nothing noble. They sang like children who are tired and do not know it and will not sleep because sleeping means stopping the good game. They sang the note that had moved the seam the first time. The harrow listened because storms have habits too. It turned an ear. In that moment, Mason's ship dumped its heat as if it were throwing off a coat to run faster. It bled. It bled and got cold. "Limiter there," he said through teeth that wanted to chatter but could not because he had trained them not to. "Sing it to me." The choir changed key. The perjury bled from their mouths again. The human tenors found the ragged high place where men's voices break and learn to balance there like birds on a wire in wind. The seam moved. Another mine went in, not like a knife but like a pebble into a throat. The harrow convulsed, and this time it convulsed not like a ship but like a body. "This thing is not alive," the analyst reminded Shava, maybe because the analyst needed reminding. "No," Shava said, "but it is obedient to a memory of someone who was." Mason did not come back from that one. He went too deep into the flood. He sang alone for a moment so the choir could breathe. He sang like a lonely drunk on a road at midnight, and the road answered him. He sang the word he had learned in the room where the heart burned, choke. He taught the harrow to choke on itself. And then he was not there. The message he had written the night before in case of not being there arrived at Shava's desk. It was not long. He did not write long things. He had learned that truth is shorter than lies. It said, "Tell them the Reaper isn't our enemy. Tell them the Reaper is our coach." Shava pinched the bridge of her nose until pain made fireworks in the dark behind her eyes. Then she stood up and went to another meeting. The war did not care who was dead. The war cared who still held a pen over the map and whose hand could be convinced to continue moving. The collective learned. The Harrow learned. The battles became less like slaughter and more like chess, which is to say still slaughter, but with manners. The council stopped scoffing at Earth stories and started asking for more, not because they suddenly believed in personified death, but because they understood that humans had a way of turning fear from a chemical into a tool. They began to build their own myths. The Ratchari wrote a story about a broodmother who learned to calm the sea with the undersides of her wings. The Seleni accepted that sometimes equations require boundary conditions that smell like incense. The Perjury, who had always understood the edge of bells, wrote a song called Overlap that ripped holes in otherwise well-behaved air. Then came the Harrow's last teacher. You could tell when something like that arrives. The war changes tone. The Harrow's next iteration did not flood. It did not wedge. It became a mirror. When it arrived, the stars multiplied. The fleet found itself surrounded not by black but by itself, refracted 1,000 times. Maneuvers became voided by their shadows. Shots returned to their gunners. The choir sang and heard their own song, multiplied and fed back, growing until the cargo bay buckled at the edges. The way a voice in a shower will make the mirror fog and ghost notes run along the tile. It had learned to take the story you tell and hand it back to you too loud to bear. Ships began to die of their own echoes. The Seleni turned their graceful engines off rather than burn in symmetry. The Ratchari tied themselves to their chairs with silk. The Vek bit their own tongues to wake from the mirror dream. Shava walked, almost ran, down crooked hallways to where the anthropologist stood at a viewport, staring at the multiplied fleet and the multiplied dead. How do you talk to something that throws your words back at you like a bad friend? She asked. You don't talk, the anthropologist said, eyes wet, not looking away. You become quiet, you become gesture. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a key. A metal key to a door that likely no longer existed except in ruin. You show it what you mean. What do we mean? Shava whispered, mouth dry, we mean to live. Psychopomp wrote its final protocol in that hour. They called it Door. They broadcast no words, no songs. They cut ship's power so that the mirrors had nothing to reflect but a shape. They formed the fleet into the simplest human word that space could read, a doorway, 2 lines, a lintel, a threshold. The Harrow reflected it. The mirror multiplied door after door until the stars were an architecture. Into that geometry the humans flew, not firing, not singing, not asking. They went as people go through a door in a burning house. By memory, by faith, by the knowledge that there is in fact a hallway on the other side because there has always been a hallway on the other side. The choir hummed, low enough to barely shake the air. The Harrow hesitated. It had learned to respond to voice. It had learned to choke on its own heat. It had learned to flood and wedge and mirror. It had not learned to watch a species make a shape and put its whole heart into the shape. It had not learned to believe in doors. The fleet poured through, not through the Harrow, through itself, through the middle of its own fear. On the other side of the shape, the choir raised their pitch and sang just enough of the limiter note to make the Harrow stop adjusting mirrors long enough to look at what it had made. It saw a house in space. It saw a threshold. It saw the void framed. It remembered, the memory built into it remembered that doors are for obedience. It obeyed, it opened itself, it pulled its seams back, it lifted its own lintel. The kiln heart burned exposed. In the thinnest breath between one muscle and the next, the fleet threw every cooling charge, every choking field, every silk-tuned ripple they had. The heart went from fire to stubborn coal to ash. The Harrow's mirrors shattered, but soundlessly, as if it had all been an exercise in rehearsal and the stage manager had finally hissed, "Enough." Pieces of the Harrow tumbled. Some remain dangerous. Danger is like rust. It does not disappear when you stop looking at it. Pieces hit Mazarath's ring and cut gardens in two. People who had never left the planet before went out in suits to patch the sky. The fleet limped home like a herd after wolves, fewer bodies, more scars, more knowledge than is comfortable to hold in one mind. The council sat in the Pearl and the Shadow again. The room smelled of ozone and sweat and victory, which smells like fear that did not win. The chair rested their head against their throne, smiling an amphibian smile that meant the muscles had finally remembered how. The Seleni delegate stood by the window and let light find the silver threads in their hair. Admiral Shava spoke. She did not speechify. She had no candle for that now. "The harrow is not over," she said. "Every tool teaches you about the hand that built it. Somewhere there is a hand. It will be empty now. It will be making a new tool. It will be angry or afraid. Both are dangerous." "Then we do not disarm," the Vex said. "No," Shava said. "We learn to live armed and gentle." "Gentle?" the Perjury asked, softly incredulous. Shava's eyes went to the viewport where Mazarath spun, ragged and still beautiful. "It matters what we look like when we win," she murmured. "We cannot become a harrow. We cannot build a mirror of our own." "Tell us another Earth story," the chair asked, surprising herself. The anthropologist tilted her head. "We have one about a man who paints death as a woman with kind eyes. He begs for one more day to finish his harvest. Death agrees." "Does he finish?" "Yes," she said, smiling with the part of her mouth that was not broken and had never been. "He finishes, then he goes. Why? Because it is not a story about cheating death. It is a story about keeping promises." Silence again, the good kind, the kind that holds. Mazarath's people began to rebuild. The fleet began to rearm. Psychopomp was not disbanded. It was placed back behind that painted-shut door with a key hanging on a nail nearby. The humans cleaned the choir's blood from the cargo bay and put down new lines for a dance one day when there would be dancing. The Ratshari wrote a lullaby for Seams. The Seleni proposed a festival with no mirrors permitted inside the city limits. The Perjury built a bell whose edge could split light, and then chose not to ring it except to say hello to friends. Shava went to the ship's small chapel, which had no religious symbols, just photographs of rivers and wheat and cities that had been. She lit a candle for Mason and let the candle teach the dark how to draw back without fleeing. She did not speak aloud. She did not need to. The Reaper, if he came, would come like a gentleman to a door with his hat in his hands. He did not come then. There was too much work to do. Work is a reprieve granted to the living, so they do not bruise themselves against the edges of what they cannot change. Word of Earth's Reaper traveled faster than the fleet. Stories do. It went on quiet ships and loud ones, on the backs of traders who loved to tell the thing that made them feel brave for a second. It arrived on planets where people had never seen a tree and did not know the smell of cut grass and still felt something ancient when they heard the idea of a figure who comes for everyone and is not cruel because cruelty is a waste of time. It arrived on worlds where a name had never been given to fear because fear was a weather there, and they learned to say a human word softly in their own languages, and the word comforted them. It terrified some. Many. Terror is the tax a species pays when it begins to understand itself. One evening, seasons later, a young Ratshari asked a human soldier in a bar made of translucent resin what it felt like to look at death without flinching. The bar hummed with the sound of a station's heart. The human looked into a drink that remembered ice a minute ago. "It's not that we don't flinch," she said. "We do. You just practice flinching and carrying on." "How do you practice?" "You tell little goodbyes," she said. "You stand up when you sit too long. You go for a walk when the rain is ugly. You make the bed on days you don't want to. You say I love you even when it sounds like you're breaking. You learn the weight of simple things. Then when the big goodbye comes, your hands have learned how to hold it. They don't drop it. They don't throw it at someone else." The Ratchari groomed his antennae trying to file away this human magic. Will the harrow return? Something like it will, she said. Someone always finds a new way to be cruel or frightened. And you? We'll be here, she said. We'll have coffee, we'll have songs, we'll have doorways, and when it comes, we'll go to meet it. That's our deal. The bar's music changed. The station spun. Somewhere ships were being built, somewhere else gardens were being planted. The universe is not either slash or, it is both slash and humans had learned to be both hammer and cradle. When the next scar arrived, because history does not visit, it moves in, the fleet was sharper. The collective stood differently, closer, as if cold had taught them what proximity was useful. The harrow's makers sent a scout. The scout found not a fearful people but a chorus. The scout did not return. Perhaps it had expected a mirror and found a door instead. Admiral Shava grew older. The scar on the anthropologist's head faded to the faintest arc, like the moon when it is too thin to be certain of, but still makes the tide think about it. The chair retired and grew ferns on a station where the gravity was kind to old knees. Mason Care's guitar hung on a wall where children saw it and understood that sound can be a weapon and a cradle both. On the anniversary of the Third Battle of Mazarath, the rings opened to the people and the ships flew slow and low. They wrote names on the light with contrails. Names of ships, names of people, names of ideas. A Ratchari child climbed onto the shoulders of a perjury who had once split light for war and now split fruit for picnics. The child asked the question children ask when adults look like they are about to break and don't know how to stop. Are we safe now? No, the perjury said. The child clung a little tighter. Then why do you smile? Because we are together, the perjury said. Because we have doors, because we know a song, because we are ready. The child considered this, then nodded solemnly in the way only children can. If the reaper comes, they said, I'll show him my drawings. The perjury laughed so hard they had to wipe their eyes. You do that, little Belle, he'll like them. When night fell, the Star City's lights came up slow. Earth people stood on balconies that were not Earth's and told new friends the old story, not to scare them, to recruit them into the project of being alive. They told how Earth had made a person out of the end and spoken to him. They told how that person had become a coach, a teacher, a neighbor whose presence made you remember to put your affairs in order, and to write that letter and to forgive that person, and to teach your hands not to shake when they had to do hard things. They told how this had frightened the aliens at first, because it is frightening to meet a species that has learned to give death a nickname and ask him to wait by the door. Then they told how it had comforted them, how it had made something like courage. At last, when the stories were done and the drinks were down to ice and the children had been carried home, the city grew as quiet as a battlefield after the last cry. Shava walked alone along the ring's edge path, palm against the rail, walking the curve that was long enough to be a kind of prayer. She stopped at a viewport and looked down into the blue-white flame of the young sun on which Mazarath rode. In the glass she saw herself, older, thinner, bright around the eyes. She saw behind her the shape of a door. It was just architecture. It was also everything. She thought of Mason and of the word he had written, choke. She thought of the anthropologist and of the word she had given the council, promise. She thought of Earth and the Reaper, and how that old gentleman had stood at so many doors when rivers rose and cities burned and plague kissed warm foreheads, and still the species had set the table, had passed the bread, had laid down to sleep and gotten up again. She thought of the harrow's heart, ash now folded into new metal that would carry flowers from one ring to another. She smiled then, but it was a small smile, the kind you offer the universe so that it knows you are polite, the kind you offer your coach to show you still believe in drills. We aren't what you thought, she said to the quiet. We don't conquer, we don't know how to be emperors, we're too untidy. We break and mend again and call that living. The rail was warm under her palm. The station hummed the way stations hum when they are deeply content to be alive. She brushed her fingers across the cold glass and left 5 prints, a human signature that meant the same thing it had meant when someone pressed a red hand on a cave wall and felt brave enough to sleep because the hand would watch for them in the dark. And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.